Mr. Thune, no. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Carver, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Pryor, aye.
wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 54, the noes are 42. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader. The Senate is in order.
we have 4 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session. They have the approval of both me and Senator McConnell, and I ask consent that these requests be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I move to reconsider vote by which cloture was not invoked on the Watt nomination.
The question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Yes, sir. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk. Yes, sir. Thank you. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey. Thank you. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bekich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cardin, Casey, Donnelly, Durbin, Gillibrand, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Kane, Landrieu, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Cornyn, Enzi, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain? No. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Corker? No. Mr. Hoeven? no. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Oh, you see him? Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Booker? Aye.
So, are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 54, the noes are 42. The motion to reconsider, the motion to invoke cloture on the nomination of Melvin Watt to be the director of HFA is agreed to.
Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Mr. President,
Majority leader.
what is the question now? What is the question now before the Senate?
The question will be on the cloture vote upon reconsideration.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
I rise to a question of order.
Mr. President, we need
Will the
order in the
Senate
Senate.
be in order? The Republican leader.
I make a point of order that nominations are fully debatable under the rules of the Senate unless 3/5 of senators chosen and sworn have voted to bring debate to a close.
Under the precedent set by the Senate on November 21st, 2013, cloture on nominations other than those to the Supreme Court of the United States is invoked by a majority vote.
I appeal the ruling of the chair and ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The question is, shall the decision of the chair stand as the judgment of the Senate? The yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baggett. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
So he's done pretty well.
Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr.
Can you explain it? I can't read it.
Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk,
Type these up? Oh. Yeah, did you type these up? Even you?
Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Lee, Levin, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Hall, Portman, Pryor, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Risch, no.
Either, so I had to take them.
Mr. Sessions, no.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 45. The Senate sustains the decision of the chair. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Melvin L. Watt of North Carolina to be Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, signed by 18 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Melvin L. Watt of North Carolina to be the Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency for a term of 5 years shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Yes, sir. I got you. I got you.
I have to no.
Yeah.
No.
Have I voted on you?
Not yet. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus. Sir. Okay. Did you get yes. Graham, Collins. Jane Hopkins. No, not yet. Thanks. Mr. Begich. Hi. I got you. Boxer. For the wall. That. I did get you. I got you, sir. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker.
Cloture. Yep. Yep. No, wait a second, sir.
Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell.
Hey, Beef, they got something for you at the house carryout.
What's that?
They got something for you at the house carryout.
What's that?
I wasn't aware that General Tsao had tofu, but he does.
Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley,
I can't imagine.
Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski,
Yeah.
Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Begich, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Cantwell, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Sessions. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander. No.